The Duke danced with no one for 3 seasons. Then she stepped on his foot by accident. The candles in the Marchioness of Whitmore's ballroom numbered in the thousands, or so it seemed to Penelopey Hartwood, as she pressed herself against a marble pillar and prayed for the floor to open and swallow her whole. Each flame flickered in the crystal chandeliers above, casting dancing light across the silk-clad shoulders of London's most distinguished families, illuminating their jewels and their judgments with equal mercilessness. Somewhere in that glittering crowd, Viscount Pemberton was undoubtedly telling everyone within earshot about the impertinent country baron's daughter who had remarked upon his hairpiece. She had not meant to say it aloud. She never meant to say any of it aloud. Of all the foolish, thoughtless, ruinous things, her mother had hissed through a smile so fixed it might have been painted on, her fingers digging into Penelope's arm with bruising force. 3 seasons. 3. And you cannot manage to keep your observations to yourself for a single evening. Penelope had apologized. She had apologized profusely, eloquently, and with genuine mortification. But the damage was done. Lady Hartwood had retreated to the card-room with a headache that owed more to fury than to any physical ailment, leaving Penelope with strict instructions to remain visible, remain pleasant, and for the love of all that was holy, remain silent. Remaining silent had never been Penelope's particular strength. She watched the dancers now from her position of relative concealment, a glass of tepid lemonade warming further in her gloved hand. The current set was a cotillion, and the couples moved through its figures with the practiced ease of those who had been trained since childhood in the art of graceful movement. Lady Arabella Worthington, widely considered the diamond of this season, executed a perfect turn with mathematical precision, her silver-blonde hair catching the candlelight like something from a fairy story. Penelope's own honey-brown hair had already begun escaping its pins. She could feel several strands tickling the back of her neck, and she knew without looking that her carefully arranged curls had collapsed into something considerably less fashionable. Her mother's maid had tried, truly she had, but Penelope's hair possessed a stubborn independence that no amount of pomade or prayer could fully subdue. Much like Penelope herself, really. She took a sip of her lemonade and grimaced at its warmth. Across the room, her younger sister Arabella, named for some distant relative, and bearing no relation to the diamond currently dazzling the dance floor, stood in a cluster of other young ladies, her dark curls perfectly behaved, her laugh perfectly pitched, her manners perfect. At 17, Arabella had been permitted to attend tonight as a preview of her own debut next season, and she was conducting herself with exactly the kind of elegant restraint that Penelope had never managed to achieve. It was not that Penelope begrudged her sister's success. She loved Arabella dearly, loved all 4 of her sisters with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes surprised even herself. But watching Arabella navigate the treacherous waters of society with such apparent ease made Penelope feel, as she so often did, that she had been assembled from the wrong pieces entirely. Other women seemed to know instinctively how to smile without showing too much teeth, how to laugh without snorting, how to express interest without expressing opinions. Other women could dance without counting the steps under their breath, could make conversation without accidentally insulting anyone, could move through a ballroom without wondering if everyone was staring at them. Penelope wondered if everyone was staring at her constantly. The answer was usually no. She was not important enough to warrant much attention, but tonight, after the toupee incident, she suspected the answer might be different. "There you are." Arabella appeared at her elbow, her young face flushed with excitement and concern in equal measure. "Mamma sent me to find you. She says you are to circulate." "I am circulating," Penelope said, "very slowly, in a stationary fashion." "Penny," Arabella's voice dropped to an urgent whisper, "everyone is talking about what happened with Lord Pemberton. Mrs. Ashby told Lady Worthington that you called him a bald fraud in front of half the room." "I did not call him a bald fraud. I merely observed, to no one in particular, that his hairpiece was listing slightly to the left, and that someone ought to tell him before it completed its journey to his shoulder. Penelope pressed her fingers to her temples. How was I to know Lady Pemberton was standing directly behind me? You might have looked. Yes, thank you. I have realized that in retrospect. Arabella sighed with the particular weariness of a younger sister who had spent her entire life watching her elder sibling court disaster. Mamma says you are to find a partner for the next set. She says, if you hide against this pillar any longer, people will think there is something wrong with you. There is something wrong with me, Penelope thought, but did not say. She had thought it often enough over the years, during long nights when sleep would not come, and she catalogued all the ways she had failed to be what she ought to be. Something was wrong with her, some essential piece missing or misaligned, and no amount of instruction or effort had ever managed to repair it. But she could not say that to Arabella, whose own debut lay ahead of her, whose own chances must not be damaged by association with her hopeless elder sister. So she straightened her spine, handed her glass to a passing footman, and summoned a smile. Very well. I shall circulate. I shall find a partner. I shall dance without stepping on anyone's feet or commenting on their personal appearance. She paused. Probably. Penny. Go back to your friends, dearest. I am sure young Lord Blackwood is wondering where you've gone. Arabella blushed prettily. She even blushed prettily, the unfairness of it, and retreated across the room with a final worried glance over her shoulder. Penelope watched her go, then turned her attention to the ballroom at large and tried to formulate a plan of attack. The supper dance would begin in perhaps half an hour. If she could secure a partner before then, she could fulfill her mother's requirements while minimizing the opportunity for further disaster. Someone safe, someone undemanding, someone who would not expect witty conversation or graceful movement or any of the other things Penelope consistently failed to provide. The refreshment table seemed as good a destination as any. It sat at the far end of the room, and reaching it would require navigating through a considerable crowd, but at least she would appear to be doing something purposeful. And perhaps, if she was very lucky, she would encounter one of the elderly gentlemen who occasionally took pity on wallflowers, men who wanted nothing more than a partner who would not tread on their gouty feet. She began her journey. The ballroom floor was treacherously crowded. Couples moved through the final figures of the cotillion with increasing enthusiasm as the music built toward its conclusion, while spectators clustered in tight knots along the edges, leaving narrow channels through which Penelope was forced to navigate. She murmured apologies as she went, pressing past silk skirts and broadcloth coats, trying to make herself small and unobtrusive. She was perhaps halfway to her destination when she noticed him. The Duke of Thornfield stood alone near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, a glass of something amber in his hand, his dark evening clothes making him look like a shadow among the colourful peacocks of the tun. Even from this distance, she could see the severe lines of his face, the way his dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, the absolute stillness with which he held himself. Everyone knew about the Duke of Thornfield. Everyone knew about Lady Helena Fairfax, the golden beauty to whom he had been betrothed, who had died in a carriage accident 3 years ago. Everyone knew that he had not danced since, that he attended society events only when absolutely required by his position, that he stood at the edges of ballrooms like a beautiful marble statue, and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. The Stone Duke, they called him, cold as granite, untouchable. Penelope had seen him before, at various events over her 3 seasons, but she had never been close enough to observe him properly. Now, pausing in her progress across the room to avoid colliding with a particularly expansive matron, she found herself studying him with frank curiosity. He did not look cold, she thought. He looked tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes visible even at this distance, and something in the set of his shoulders suggested not aristocratic disdain, but rather a profound exhaustion with the entire enterprise of human interaction. He looked like a man who was performing a duty he found unbearable, and performing it alone because there was no one he could share the burden with. Penelope knew something about that. She knew about standing at the edges of rooms, wishing to be anywhere else, enduring because endurance was required. The difference was that she could not afford to simply refuse participation. She did not have the power or the privilege to stand apart and let the world go on without her. What must it be like, she wondered, to be so powerful that you could simply opt out? To be so wealthy and so titled that no one could force you to dance if you did not wish to, that no one could compel you to smile or make pleasant conversation or pretend to be enjoying yourself. It must be lonely, she decided, even lonelier than being the awkward daughter of an impoverished baron, stepping on toes and commenting on toupees. The cotillion ended with a flourish. The dancers applauded, then began to disperse across the floor in search of refreshment or new partners. The crowd shifted and swelled around Penelope, and she found herself suddenly hemmed in on all sides, unable to move forward or back. "Pardon me," she said to a woman's silk-clad back. "Excuse me. I'm terribly sorry. Could I just—" A couple swept past her, clearly eager to reach the refreshment table themselves, and Penelope stepped backward quickly to avoid being struck by an enthusiastically swinging arm. Her heel came down firmly on something that was definitely not the floor. Someone made a sound, not quite a grunt, more like a sharp intake of breath, and Penelope felt the awful, unmistakable sensation of a human foot beneath her own. She spun around, apologies already tumbling from her lips. "Oh, I am so terribly sorry. I didn't see you there. The crowd pushed me, and I stepped back without looking. Are you injured? I do hope I haven't—" The words died in her throat. The Duke of Thornfield looked down at her with an expression of such perfect frozen astonishment that Penelope felt her stomach drop to somewhere around her knees. His grey eyes, the colour of winter storms, she thought wildly. The colour of London skies in January, stared at her as though she were some species of exotic creature he had never before encountered. Around them, the crowd had gone absolutely, perfectly still. Penelope's voice emerged as barely more than a squeak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I am so very sorry, Your Grace. That was entirely my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going and the crowd, and I was trying to reach the refreshment table and—" She was babbling. She knew she was babbling. She could not seem to stop. "And I do hope I haven't injured you, though I realize that's probably not actually possible. Stepping on someone's foot through evening slippers doesn't usually cause lasting damage, does it? Though I suppose it might if one were particularly heavy, which I'm not, I don't think. Though I haven't actually weighed myself recently. Miss Hartwood." His voice was low, quiet, and somehow managed to cut through both her babbling and the whispers that had begun to ripple through the surrounding crowd. Penelope's mouth snapped shut with an audible click of teeth. "You know my name?" she heard herself ask, and immediately wished she could take the words back. Of course he didn't know her name. He had probably heard someone say it at some point. Or he was guessing. Or he had simply invented a name to make her stop talking. "We were introduced last season," the Duke said, "at Lady Ashford's musicale." "We were?" Penelope ransacked her memory and came up empty. She was quite certain she would have remembered being introduced to the most intimidating man in London. I'm afraid I don't recall." "You were distracted. I believe you were attempting to escape a conversation with Lord Petersham about his collection of snuff boxes." The memory surfaced suddenly. A receiving line, a blur of names and faces, her mind entirely occupied with devising an excuse to flee the elderly Viscount, who had been describing his 347 snuff boxes in excruciating detail. She had paid attention to nothing and no one during those introductions. "I was distracted," she agreed weakly. He had very strong opinions about the proper way to take snuff. He does. The Duke's expression had not changed, still that frozen astonishment, but something flickered in his grey eyes. He once spent 45 minutes explaining the technique to me at a dinner party. 45 minutes? I timed it. Penelope felt an inappropriate bubble of laughter rising in her chest and ruthlessly suppressed it. This was not a moment for laughter. This was a moment for apology and retreat. She had just stepped on the foot of the most notorious recluse in London, a man who had not danced with anyone in 3 years, and half the ballroom was watching to see what would happen next. "I really am very sorry," she said, trying to gather the shreds of her dignity. "About your foot, I mean, and about not remembering our introduction, and about the snuff-box comparison. I didn't mean to imply that you were as boring as Lord Petersham. You didn't imply that, though I realize that's how it sounded, comparing your conversation to his, and truly I meant it as a compliment, or at least an acknowledgement that we have both suffered through his monologues. Miss Hartwood." She stopped talking. The Duke of Thornfield looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the whispers had grown louder, and Penelope was acutely aware that they had become the centre of attention for everyone within 50 feet. The Stone Duke was speaking to someone. The Stone Duke had been touched by someone. This was apparently news of the highest order. "Would you do me the honour," he said slowly, as though the words were being dragged from him against his will, "of dancing the next set with me?" The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that Penelope could hear the candles flickering in the chandeliers above. She stared at him. He stared back. His expression had shifted into something she couldn't quite read. Determination, perhaps, or resignation, or something that might have been curiosity, if it weren't so heavily armoured in aristocratic reserve. She began. "Your Grace, I don't think—" "It's a simple question, Miss Hartwood. Yes or no?" It was not a simple question. There was nothing simple about it. The Duke of Thornfield had not danced with anyone since his betrothed died. He stood at the edges of ballrooms and watched and waited for the acceptable moment to leave. He did not dance. He certainly did not dance with the awkward daughters of impoverished country barons who stepped on his feet and babbled about snuff-boxes. "Is this a jest?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Because if it is, I should tell you that I've already been the subject of quite enough mockery this evening, and I would really prefer— It is not a jest." His voice had hardened slightly, and something like offence flickered across his features. "I do not jest, Miss Hartwood. I am asking you to dance. But you don't dance. I am aware of my own habits. You haven't danced with anyone in 3 years. I am aware of that as well. Why would you want to dance with me?" The question hung between them, too honest, too raw, too revealing of all the insecurities that Penelope usually tried to keep hidden beneath her chatter. She felt herself flush, and wished desperately that she had simply said yes, or no, or anything other than that naked plea for explanation. The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, pitched for her ears alone. "Because you looked at me as though I were a person," he said, "rather than a title, or a prospect, or a cautionary tale. Because you apologized for stepping on my foot as though it actually mattered to you. Because you are the first person in 3 years who has spoken to me about snuff-boxes, rather than offering condolences or asking impertinent questions about my intentions toward remarriage." Penelope had no idea what to say to that. She had no idea what to do with the sudden, unexpected glimpse of the man behind the marble facade. She had no idea how to respond to the raw honesty in his voice, so different from the cold formality she had expected. The orchestra was tuning for the next set. Around them, couples were beginning to take their positions on the floor. The whispers had resumed, urgent and excited, and Penelope knew that every eye in the room was fixed upon them. She should say no. She should make her excuses and retreat to her pillar, and avoid any further opportunities for disaster. She was a terrible dancer on her best days, and this was very far from her best day, and the thought of trying to navigate a set with the entire ton, watching her every misstep, filled her with something approaching terror. But he had asked, and he had looked at her as though she were a person too, as though she were not merely the awkward baron's daughter who said too much and danced too poorly and could never quite manage to be what she was supposed to be. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I would be honored, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something that might have been relief or surprise, or perhaps just a slight softening of the frozen lines around his eyes. "Then shall we?" He offered his arm with formal precision. Penelope placed her hand on his sleeve and allowed him to lead her toward the dance floor. She was aware of the heads turning to watch them, the fans snapping open to conceal whispered comments, the absolute sensation they were creating simply by walking together across the room. The Duke of Thornfield was going to dance. The Stone Duke had chosen a partner, and he had chosen her. The thought was almost absurd enough to make her laugh. "I should warn you," she said quietly as they took their places for the set. "I am not a very good dancer. I tend to lose count of the steps, and I move left when I should move right. And last week I accidentally elbowed Lord Whitley in the ribs during a country dance. I shall endeavour to protect my ribs." Was that almost a joke? Penelope glanced up at him, trying to read his expression, but his face had settled back into its customary severity. Only his eyes betrayed any hint of the man who had spoken so honestly to her moments ago, grey and watchful, assessing her with an intensity that made her simultaneously nervous and oddly reassured. "I also talk too much when I'm anxious," she continued, because apparently she had decided to catalogue all her faults at once. "Which you may have noticed. I fill silences with words because silence makes me uncomfortable, and then I say things I shouldn't say, and then I make everything worse, and I'm doing it right now. Aren't I?" "You are. I'm sorry." "Don't be." His voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the opening notes of the music. "I find it refreshing." The dance began. It was a quadrille, which was simultaneously better and worse than other options. Better because the complexity of the figures meant constant movement and little opportunity for extended conversation. Worse because the complexity of the figures meant countless opportunities for error, and Penelope was painfully aware of every eye in the room tracking her steps. For the first minute, she was too tense to do anything but concentrate. She counted steps in her head, 1, 2, 3, 4, turn, 1, 2, 3, 4, pass, and managed to execute the basic figures without incident. The Duke led with steady competence, his hand sure on hers when their palms met. His movements precise, if perhaps a bit rusty from 3 years of disuse. When the figure brought them together for a brief promenade, he spoke. "You're counting." "I'm sorry?" "Under your breath. You're counting the steps." Penelope felt her cheeks flame. "I told you I wasn't very good. I didn't say it was a criticism." They separated for the next figure, then came together again. "I used to count too, when I was learning. My dancing master despaired of me." "You?" She couldn't quite keep the disbelief from her voice. Everything about him spoke of natural aristocratic grace, the kind of easy elegance that came from generations of breeding. "I was 14 and gangly and convinced that dancing was beneath me. My father had to threaten to withhold my allowance before I would consent to lessons." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I suspect the dancing master was more relieved than I was when the lessons finally ended." The image of a young, awkward Duke of Thornfield scowling through dance lessons was so incongruous that Penelope forgot her steps entirely. She moved right when she should have moved left, and felt their shoulders collide with a soft impact. "Sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry, I lost count." It's quite all right. His hand found hers again, guiding her back into the pattern. I believe I distracted you deliberately. You did? You were thinking so hard about the steps that you were forgetting to actually dance. Sometimes distraction is useful. Penelope considered this as they moved through the next figure. He was right, she realized. For a moment there, when she had been surprised by his admission, she had stopped counting, stopped worrying, stopped thinking about all the ways she might fail. And in that moment, her body had simply moved, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. Why did you ask me to dance? The question emerged before she could think better of it. Truly, you could have simply accepted my apology and walked away. They separated, circled, returned. I told you why. You told me I looked at you like a person. That's not really an answer. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on something over her shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the music. I have stood at the edge of 100 ballrooms over the past 3 years. I have watched 1,000 dances I had no intention of joining. I have perfected the art of being present without participating, of fulfilling my obligations without actually engaging with any of it. He met her eyes then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. Tonight, for the first time, someone made me want to stop watching. I can't explain it better than that. Penelope had no response. She had no words at all, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing that had happened all evening. She simply looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that she could not name but could not deny. The music swelled toward its conclusion. The final figures required their attention, and they moved through them in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the awkward silence of two strangers thrown together by circumstance, but something more like the comfortable silence of two people who had unexpectedly found common ground. When the quadrille ended, Penelope dropped into a curtsy as the Duke bowed. Around them, applause rippled through the room, but she barely heard it. She was too aware of her own heartbeat, too aware of his presence beside her, too aware that something significant had just happened, even if she couldn't quite identify what it was. "Thank you," the Duke said formally, "for the dance. Thank you for asking." Penelope straightened and found herself reluctant to step away. "And for not mocking me when I went left instead of right. I went right instead of left twice. I believe we're even." "I didn't notice." "I noticed you not noticing. It was kind." There was something almost wistful in his voice. Something that made Penelope want to reach out and touch his arm, to offer comfort for a wound she couldn't see, but could sense nonetheless. She restrained herself. This was still a ballroom, still a public space, still a place where every gesture was observed and analyzed. "I should return you to your mother," the Duke said, and the formal mask was back in place, the walls rebuilt. "It would be improper for me to monopolize your attention. My mother will be in the card room. She had a headache. Then I shall escort you to the card room." He offered his arm again, and again Penelope took it, and again she was aware of the whispers following them as they made their way across the ballroom. But this time, strangely, she didn't mind quite so much. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. For the space of one quadrille, she had been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood what it was like to stand apart, to watch from the edges, to perform a role that never quite fit. They reached the doorway to the card room, and the Duke stopped. "Miss Hartwood." "Your Grace." He hesitated, and for a moment the mask slipped again, showing something uncertain beneath. "I enjoyed our dance." "So did I." It was the truth. Despite her fears, despite her mistakes, despite everything, she had enjoyed it. "Though I fear I may have damaged your reputation," People will say the Stone Duke has thawed. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at her use of the common nickname. And then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth curved upward in what could only be described as a smile. "Let them say it," he said softly. "Perhaps it's time." He bowed again, deeply and formally, and then he was gone, melting back into the crowd as though he had never been there at all. Penelope stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hand still tingling where his glove had touched hers, her heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with the music still playing in the ballroom beyond. Then she took a deep breath, composed her features, and went to find her mother. Lady Hartwood was not in the card room. Lady Hartwood was in a corner of the refreshment room, her headache apparently cured, holding court among a group of matrons who were all speaking at once and casting significant glances toward the doorway through which Penelope had just entered. "Penelope!" Her mother's voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "There you are. Come here at once." Penelope approached with the wariness of a mouse approaching a cat. Her mother's expression was difficult to read, some mixture of shock, calculation, and barely suppressed hope that made Penelope's stomach clench with unease. "I understand," Lady Hartwood said, her voice pitched to carry, "that you danced with the Duke of Thornfield." "Yes, Mamma." "The Duke of Thornfield, who has not danced with anyone in 3 years." "Yes, Mamma." "The Duke of Thornfield, whose worth is estimated at 40,000 a year, who possesses 3 estates, and who is widely considered the most eligible bachelor in England, despite his unfortunate attachment to the memory of his dead betrothed." "Mamma." Penelope felt her cheeks flame. "Could we perhaps discuss this somewhere more private?" "Don't be ridiculous. Everyone already knows." Lady Hartwood's eyes were bright with a fervour Penelope recognized all too well, the fervour of a desperate mother who had finally glimpsed hope on the horizon. "How did this happen? What did you say to him? Did he indicate any particular interest in furthering the acquaintance?" "I stepped on his foot." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. "You what?" Lady Hartwood's voice had gone very, very quiet. "I stepped on his foot. By accident. I was trying to get to the refreshment table, and the crowd pushed me, and I stepped backward onto his foot. And then I apologized, and we talked for a moment, and he asked me to dance." Penelope shrugged helplessly. "I don't know why. I asked him, and he said it was because I looked at him like a person." Lady Hartwood stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned to the assembled matrons, who were all watching with expressions of avid curiosity. "My daughter," she announced with brittle brightness, "has just secured the first dance the Duke of Thornfield has granted in 3 years, by stepping on his foot." "It does seem unlikely," one of the matrons murmured. "My Penelope has always had unconventional methods," Lady Hartwood replied, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "It appears they are finally bearing fruit." Penelope closed her eyes and wished, not for the first time that evening, for the floor to open beneath her. The rest of the ball passed in a blur of whispered questions and speculative glances that Penelope endured with as much grace as she could muster. She did not see the Duke again when she finally escaped her mother's clutches and returned to the ballroom. He had vanished, presumably having fulfilled whatever obligation had brought him there in the first place. But she could not stop thinking about him. In the carriage home, while her mother planned and schemed and calculated aloud, and Arabella sat in awkward silence, Penelope stared out the window at the dark streets of Mayfair, and remembered the way his grey eyes had softened when he spoke of standing at the edges of ballrooms. She remembered the almost smile when he admitted to counting steps as a boy. She remembered the quiet honesty of his confession. Tonight, for the first time, someone made me want to stop watching. What had that meant? What could it possibly mean? She was nobody, the eldest daughter of an impoverished baron, a 3-season veteran with a reputation for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. She had nothing to offer a duke, nothing that could possibly interest a man of his wealth and position and consequence, and yet he had asked her to dance, and yet he had smiled, and yet, for the space of 1 quadrille, she had felt something she had never felt before in the suffocating world of London society. She had felt seen. The carriage rattled through the empty streets toward their modest rented townhouse, and Penelope pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass of the window and wondered if she would ever see him again. Across London, in the oppressive grandeur of Thornfield House, Sebastian Ashworth sat alone in his study and wondered the same thing. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls, lined with books he rarely read, and portraits of ancestors who seemed to judge him from their frames. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the table beside him. He had poured it hours ago, when he first returned from the Whitmore ball, but he had not been able to bring himself to drink it. He could not stop thinking about her. Miss Penelopey Hartwood, the Baron's daughter with the honey-brown hair and the warm amber eyes, and the absolute inability to stop talking when she was nervous. The woman who had stepped on his foot and then apologized as though she had committed a cardinal sin. The woman who had looked at him, really looked at him, and seen something other than his title, or his tragedy, or his wealth. He had not meant to ask her to dance. He had not planned it, had not even considered the possibility, until the words were already leaving his mouth. For 3 years he had held himself apart, had refused every invitation, had cultivated a reputation for coldness that protected him from the pitying glances and the calculating approaches that would otherwise have plagued him. Dancing was too intimate, too public, too much a reminder of everything he had lost. Helena had loved to dance. She had been brilliant at it, graceful and light, moving through figures with the natural ease of someone born to the ballroom. He had loved watching her, loved partnering her, loved the way her eyes sparkled when the music swelled. Their wedding had been meant to include a ball, their first dance as husband and wife, and she had planned it down to the smallest detail. She had been on her way to the modiste to have her wedding dress fitted when the carriage accident occurred. If he had accompanied her as she asked, if he had not stayed behind to review estate business that could easily have waited, he might have been able to do something. He might have seen the danger, might have called out a warning, might have died with her instead of living on, alone with his guilt and his grief and his endless, crushing regret. For 3 years, he had not danced. For 3 years, he had stood at the edges of ballrooms and watched others do what he could not bring himself to do. For 3 years, he had been the Stone Duke, frozen and untouchable, and he had told himself that this was right. This was proper. This was the only way to honor the memory of the woman he had loved and failed. And then Miss Hartwood had stepped on his foot. Sebastian almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Of all the ways he might have expected his self-imposed exile to end, being trodden upon by a flustered baron's daughter had not featured among them. But there had been something in her face, in the genuine mortification of her apology, in the way she had looked at him without the calculating assessment he saw in other women's eyes. She had not seemed to care about his title or his fortune. She had cared only that she had caused him pain, however minor, and that she had perhaps made a fool of herself in the process. And then she had started talking. About snuff-boxes of all things. About Lord Petersham's interminable lectures. About her own failings as a dancer. Her tendency to go left when she should go right, her inability to stop talking when she was nervous. She had catalogued her flaws with a self-deprecating honesty that had somehow pierced straight through his defences, and before he quite knew what he was doing, he was asking her to dance. The expression on her face when he asked the disbelief, the suspicion, the dawning wonder when she realized he was serious, had been worth every whispered speculation that had followed them across the ballroom floor. She was a terrible dancer, truly terrible. She counted the steps under her breath and forgot them anyway, moved in the wrong direction at least twice, and nearly collided with another couple during one of the more complex figures. But she had tried so hard, and she had been so earnestly apologetic about her mistakes, and when he had told her about his own youthful struggles with dance lessons, she had looked at him as though he had given her a gift. "You?" she had said, with such genuine surprise that he had almost smiled. He had smiled, he realized. At the end, when she made that comment about the Stone Duke thawing, he had actually smiled. Sebastian could not remember the last time he had smiled. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out at the darkened garden below. The house was silent around him. No family, no companions, just the servants moving quietly through their duties, and the eternal presence of the past pressing down upon him from every corner. He should not think about Miss Hartwood. He should not think about the warmth in her amber eyes, or the way her hair had slowly escaped its pins throughout their dance, or the honest vulnerability in her voice when she had asked, "Why would you want to dance with me?" She was unsuitable in every practical way. Her father was a minor baron with no fortune to speak of. Her reputation, from what he understood, was for being charmingly unconventional at best and hopelessly unmarriageable at worst. She had nothing to offer him, no connections, no wealth, no social consequence. And yet, she had made him feel something other than numb for the first time in 3 years. And yet she had looked at him like a person, not a prospect. And yet she had smiled at him as though his company were a gift, not a prize to be won. Sebastian pressed his hand against the cold glass of the window and thought about Helena. Sweet Helena, who had loved him, who had been taken from him, who had left a hole in his heart that he had been certain would never heal. But hearts, perhaps, were more resilient than he had believed. Hearts, perhaps, could crack and break, and still, somehow, begin to mend. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if he would see Miss Hartwood again, or what he would say to her if he did, or what any of this meant for the careful, frozen life he had constructed for himself. But for the first time in 3 years, he wanted to find out. The fire had burned down to embers, and the candles guttered in their holders, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck 3 in the morning. Sebastian stood alone at his window, watching the stars emerge from behind the clouds, and wondered if this was what hope felt like. He had almost forgotten. 3 days after the Whitmore ball, Penelope stood in the morning room of their rented townhouse and tried to convince herself that she had imagined everything. The dance, the conversation, the way the Duke of Thornfield had looked at her as though she were the only person in a room of hundreds. All of it must have been some elaborate fantasy conjured by her desperate mind, because surely nothing so extraordinary could have happened to ordinary Penelopey Hartwood. And yet the evidence suggested otherwise. The morning after the ball, 3 bouquets had arrived at their door. The day after that, 5. Yesterday, 7. All from gentlemen who had never before shown the slightest interest in her existence, all suddenly eager to secure her hand for the next dance, the next dinner, the next anything. Lady Hartwood had received no fewer than 12 morning callers in the past 48 hours, all expressing their admiration for her eldest daughter's grace, wit, and charming unconventionality. The Ton had decided that Miss Penelopey Hartwood was interesting. It was, Penelope thought as she stared at the latest stack of calling cards, absolutely terrifying. "You must wear the green silk to Lady Ashworth's musicale this evening," her mother announced, sweeping into the room with a list in her hand and a martial light in her eyes. "It brings out your complexion, and I've heard the Duke of Thornfield has accepted the invitation." Penelope's heart performed an uncomfortable somersault. "He has?" "Lady Ashworth's daughter is married to his cousin. He can hardly refuse a family obligation." Lady Hartwood consulted her list with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "You will position yourself near the pianoforte. You will speak only when spoken to. You will not comment on anyone's appearance, attire, or personal grooming choices. Is that understood? Yes, Mamma. And for heaven's sake, try not to step on anyone's feet. I make no promises. Lady Hartwood's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before she could respond, the sound of the front door opening interrupted them. A moment later, Arabella burst into the morning room, her cheeks flushed from her walk in the park with their maid, her eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "Penny, you'll never guess what I heard. Lady Blackwood was walking with her daughter, and they were talking about you, and they said—" She broke off, glancing at their mother, then continued in a slightly lower voice. "They said the Duke of Thornfield asked after you at White's yesterday. He asked Lord Ashworth if you were expected at the musicale tonight." The somersault in Penelope's heart intensified into something more like a full acrobatic routine. "He asked after me? He asked if you would be there. Lord Ashworth told Lady Blackwood, who told her daughter, who told me just now in the park." Arabella clutched Penelope's hands with sisterly fervour. "Oh, Penny, do you think he means to court you? An actual duke? Can you imagine?" Penelope could not imagine. That was precisely the problem. "I'm sure he was simply being polite," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We danced once. People dance together all the time without it meaning anything." "He hasn't danced with anyone in 3 years, Arabella pointed out. "And he asked after you specifically. That's not nothing, Penny." "Your sister is right," Lady Hartwood said, and there was something almost soft in her expression. Something that might have been hope, or pride, or simply the relief of a mother who had begun to despair of her eldest daughter ever making a suitable match. "The Duke's interest is significant. We must not squander this opportunity." Penelope opened her mouth to protest, to point out that one dance and one inquiry did not constitute interest, that she was surely reading too much into the situation, that men like the Duke of Thornfield did not form attachments to women like her. But the words died on her lips, because she remembered the way he had looked at her across the ballroom. She remembered the quiet confession in his voice when he spoke of standing at the edges of rooms. She remembered the almost smile, and the warmth in his grey eyes, and the way her heart had felt when he said, "Perhaps it's time. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps, for once in her life, something extraordinary was actually happening to her." "I'll wear the green silk," she said quietly. Lady Hartwood smiled. The musicale was precisely as tedious as Penelope had expected. Lady Ashworth's drawing-room was filled to bursting with the cream of London society, all arranged on uncomfortable gilt chairs facing a pianoforte, where a succession of young ladies were demonstrating their accomplishments with varying degrees of success. The current performer, Miss Eugenia Blackwood, was attacking a Mozart sonata with more enthusiasm than skill, and Penelope found herself wincing at every missed note. She had positioned herself near the pianoforte as instructed, though not so near as to be obvious about it. Her mother sat 3 rows back, close enough to observe, but far enough to grant the illusion of independence. Arabella had been claimed by a group of young ladies her own age and was giggling over something in the corner, and the Duke of Thornfield was nowhere to be seen. Penelope tried not to feel disappointed. She had no right to feel disappointed. He had made her no promises, offered her no declarations, done nothing except dance with her once, and apparently ask a casual question about her attendance at a musicale. She was building castles in the air on the flimsiest of foundations, and she would do well to remember that. Miss Blackwood's sonata came to a merciful end, and the room erupted in polite applause. The next performer was announced a Miss Cavendish, who was apparently going to favour them with a selection of Italian arias, and Penelope settled back in her chair to endure. "Miss Hartwood." The voice came from directly behind her, low and quiet, and Penelope nearly jumped out of her skin. She turned to find the Duke of Thornfield standing in the doorway that led to the rear of the room, half concealed by a velvet curtain. How long had he been there? How had she not noticed him arrive? "Your Grace," she managed, her voice slightly breathless. "I didn't see you come in. I used the servants' entrance." His lips twitched in that almost smile she remembered. "Lady Ashworth's front hall was rather crowded, and I find myself disinclined toward crowds this evening." "That seems wise. The front hall was indeed a crush when we arrived." Penelope hesitated, acutely aware that they were having a conversation during a performance which was technically improper. "Should we, perhaps? Would you care for some air?" He gestured toward the doorway behind him. "Lady Ashworth's conservatory is quite pleasant, and considerably quieter than this room." Penelope glanced toward her mother, who was watching them with an expression of barely concealed triumph, and then toward Miss Cavendish, who was launching into her first aria with gusto. The thought of escaping both the performance and her mother's scrutiny was almost irresistible. "That sounds lovely," she said, and rose from her chair. The Duke led her through a series of corridors and into a glass-walled conservatory filled with exotic plants. Gaslight flickered from brass fixtures along the walls, casting warm shadows across banks of ferns and orchids and flowers Penelope could not identify. The air was humid and fragrant, and the sounds of the musicale faded to a distant murmur. "This is beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed. "I had no idea Lady Ashworth had such a collection." "Her passion, I believe. She's been cultivating these specimens for 30 years. The Duke moved to stand beside a particularly spectacular orchid, its purple blooms glowing like jewels in the gaslight. "It's the only interesting thing about these gatherings, frankly. The conservatory. Not a devotee of Italian arias, Your Grace? I find them excessive." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Though I suspect my dislike has more to do with the setting than the music itself." "You don't enjoy musicales?" "I don't enjoy any of it. The balls, the dinners, the endless parade of social obligations." His voice had gone quiet, reflective. "For 3 years I've attended because duty required it, but I've never participated." "Not really." Penelope thought about her own experiences, the countless events she had endured, the feeling of standing at the edges of rooms and watching others move through a world she could never quite enter. "I think I understand," she said softly. "It's like watching a play in which everyone has been given a script except you." The Duke looked at her with that penetrating grey gaze. "Yes, exactly like that." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the humid warmth of the conservatory and the faint strains of music from the distant drawing room. Penelope was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the breadth of his shoulders, the way the gaslight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the intensity of his attention focused entirely upon her. "May I ask you something?" she said, before she could think better of it. "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "At the ball, you said I made you want to stop watching. What did you mean by that?" The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear it. 3 years ago, I lost someone. My betrothed." He paused, and she saw his jaw tighten. "She died in a carriage accident, 3 weeks before our wedding." "I'm so sorry." The words felt inadequate, hollow, but she meant them with her whole heart. "I can't imagine—" "No, you can't. No one can, really, unless they've experienced it themselves." He turned away from her, looking out through the glass walls at the darkness beyond. "After she died, I closed myself off. It seemed easier, safer. If I didn't engage with anyone, if I didn't allow myself to feel anything, then I couldn't be hurt again." Penelope said nothing. She simply waited, sensing that he needed to speak, and that her role was to listen. It worked, for a time. I became exactly what everyone expected the grieving Duke, the tragic figure, the man who had turned to stone. And eventually, the grief faded, but the stone remained. He turned back to face her, and there was something raw in his expression, something vulnerable. I told myself I preferred it that way. I told myself I didn't want to feel anything ever again. And then you stepped on my foot. A startled laugh escaped her. That's a rather anticlimactic catalyst for emotional transformation. Perhaps. His lips curved in that almost smile. But there you were, apologizing so earnestly, talking so much, looking at me as though I were just a man rather than a monument to tragedy. And something cracked. Something that had been frozen for 3 years began to thaw. Penelope felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. I didn't do anything special. I just talked too much and stepped on your foot. You treated me like a human being. That was special enough. He stepped closer, and she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something darker, more masculine. Miss Hartwood, I am not a man who makes decisions impulsively. I have spent 3 years carefully constructing walls around myself, and I am not in the habit of allowing anyone past them. Then why are you telling me this? Because I don't want to lie to you. Because you deserve to know what you would be engaging with. If you were to... He stopped, his jaw tightening again. Forgive me. I am getting ahead of myself. Your Grace. Sebastian. The word emerged quietly but firmly. When we are alone, when there is no one to overhear, I would like you to call me Sebastian. Penelope's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. That would be highly improper. Yes, it would. My mother would have an apoplexy. Probably. And if anyone were to discover that we were on such familiar terms, my reputation would be ruined beyond repair. That is accurate. She looked up at him, at his grey eyes and his severe features, and the faint lines of pain that 3 years of grief had carved around his mouth. Sebastian, she said softly, tasting the name, feeling it settle into something that felt almost like rightness. His breath caught. Actually caught, audibly, and something in his expression shifted from guardedness to wonder. Penelope, he said, and her name in his voice was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. They stood there, in the humid warmth of Lady Ashworth's conservatory, surrounded by orchids and ferns and the faint music of distant Italian arias, and Penelope felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this single moment, this single man, this single impossible connection. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, and they both took a quick step back. We should return, the Duke said, and his voice had gone formal again, the walls rebuilding before her eyes. Your absence will have been noted. Yes, of course. Penelope smoothed her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. We should absolutely return. But neither of them moved. Miss Hartwood. He paused, then corrected himself. Penelope, may I call on you tomorrow? Properly, I mean. In the afternoon. Yes. The word emerged before she could think. Yes. I would like that very much. He nodded once, a sharp gesture, and then he was gone, disappearing through a different door than the one they had entered by. Penelope stood alone among the orchids, her heart racing, her mind spinning, trying to understand what had just happened and what it might mean. When she finally returned to the musicale, Miss Cavendish was on her 4th aria, and her mother's expression suggested that Penelope would be facing an extensive interrogation the moment they reached the carriage. She found she didn't mind at all. The Duke of Thornfield called the next afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, He arrived in an elegant carriage drawn by matched greys, wore a coat of deep blue superfine that made his eyes look almost silver, and brought with him a small girl in a black dress who clung to his hand with obvious apprehension. "Miss Hartwood," he said formally, as Penelope rose to greet him in the drawing-room where she had been waiting, not at all anxiously, for the past 2 hours. "May I present my niece, Lady Charlotte Ashworth. Charlotte, this is Miss Hartwood." The child was perhaps 7 years old, with dark hair pulled back severely from a pale, solemn face. Her mourning dress was impeccable but slightly too large, as though she had been expected to grow into it and hadn't yet. Her eyes, grey like her uncle's, were red-rimmed, as though she had been crying recently. "How do you do?" Charlotte said in a small, careful voice, executing a perfect curtsy. Penelope's heart immediately melted. "How do you do, Lady Charlotte? It's a pleasure to meet you." She crouched down slightly, bringing herself closer to the child's eye level. "That's a very beautiful dress. Is it new?" Charlotte looked down at her black skirts with an expression that was far too old for her years. "It was my mother's. The modiste altered it for me." Penelope felt something twist in her chest. She glanced up at the Duke, who was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between protectiveness and pain. "Your mother must have had excellent taste," Penelope said gently. "The fabric is lovely, and black is so elegant, don't you think? Very sophisticated for a young lady." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, as though this perspective had never occurred to her. "Do you think so?" "I do. When I was your age, I longed to wear something other than white and pink, but my mother insisted. I was quite jealous of older girls who were allowed to wear darker colours." "My mother liked pink," Charlotte said, and her voice wavered slightly. "She had a pink morning dress that she wore on Sundays." "Then she sounds like a woman who knew her own mind. That's an admirable quality." Charlotte nodded, apparently satisfied with this assessment, and some of the tension left her small shoulders. She looked up at her uncle with something that might have been approval. The Duke's expression had softened into something Penelope had not seen before, a tenderness that transformed his severe features into something almost handsome. "Miss Hartwood," he said, "I wondered if you might join us for a walk in Hyde Park. Charlotte has been eager to see the ducks in the Serpentine, and I thought perhaps—" "I would be delighted," Penelope said before he could finish. "Let me fetch my bonnet." They walked through the sun-dappled paths of Hyde Park, Charlotte between them, her small hands clasped in both of theirs. Other families strolled past, and Penelope was aware of the speculative glances, the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. The Duke of Thornfield out walking, with a woman, with a child, the Stone Duke thawing before their very eyes. But she found she didn't care about the gossip. She cared only about the way Charlotte's grip tightened on her hand when a large dog bounded past, and the way the Duke Sebastian, she reminded herself, though she dared not call him that aloud, smiled when his niece laughed at a particularly fat duck, and the way the three of them seemed to fit together, somehow, as though they had been doing this forever. "Charlotte's parents died in the same accident as my betrothed," Sebastian said quietly, while Charlotte had darted ahead to toss breadcrumbs to the ducks. "Her mother was Helena's sister. I became her guardian, but I—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "I have not been a good one." "Why not?" "Because looking at her reminded me of everything I had lost. Because her grief was a mirror of my own, and I could not bear to see it. Because I was too consumed by my own pain to help her with hers." His voice was rough with self-condemnation. "For 3 years I have kept her at Thornfield Manor with governesses and tutors, and I have visited only when absolutely necessary. I have failed her completely." Penelope watched Charlotte scatter breadcrumbs with careful precision, her small face intent on the ducks jostling for position. "You brought her to London," she said. "You brought her here today. That doesn't seem like failure to me. I brought her because she insisted. A note of wonder entered his voice. After the ball, after I realized certain things, I went to Thornfield to see her, and she told me, in no uncertain terms, that she was tired of being left behind, that she wanted to come to London with me, that she wanted— He stopped, shaking his head. She wanted to meet the lady who made me smile. Penelope's heart clenched. She knew about the ball, the servants' talk, news travels, even to country estates. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his grey eyes that made her breath catch. Charlotte has not seen me smile in 3 years, Miss Hartwood. She has not seen me engage with anyone or anything beyond the bare minimum required by duty. And then, suddenly, I return from London and I am different. She noticed immediately. Children notice everything. So she demanded to meet the lady responsible. In those exact words, yes. The almost smile appeared again. She is remarkably imperious for a 7-year-old. She comes by it honestly, I expect. Sebastian laughed, actually laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Charlotte looked up from her ducks, her small face breaking into a delighted grin at the sound. "Uncle Sebastian is laughing," she announced to the ducks, as though this were news of great import. "He never laughs." "Perhaps he is practicing," Penelope suggested. "Laughter is a skill like any other. It improves with use." Charlotte considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher contemplating the nature of existence. Then he should practice more often, she decided. With you. You make him laugh. Charlotte, Sebastian's voice held a warning note. You said so yourself. You said she made you feel less like stone and more like a person. I was listening at the door. Penelope felt her cheeks flush. Sebastian's expression was somewhere between mortification and reluctant amusement. "We will discuss the impropriety of eavesdropping later," he told his niece sternly. "For now, I believe the ducks have had quite enough bread." But Charlotte was not so easily diverted. She marched up to Penelope and fixed her with a penetrating grey stare that was uncannily like her uncle's. "Are you going to marry Uncle Sebastian?" she asked. "Because I think you should. He's much nicer when you're around, and he needs someone to make him laugh, and I—" Her voice wobbled slightly. "I want a proper family again, not just governesses and a great empty house." The words hung in the air, heavy with a child's desperate honesty. Penelope looked at Charlotte's hopeful, vulnerable face, and then at Sebastian's stricken expression, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. "Lady Charlotte," she said gently, kneeling down to meet the child's eyes, "I have only known your uncle for a very short time. It would be quite premature for me to make any promises about the future." Charlotte's face fell. "However," Penelope continued, "I can promise you this. I care about your uncle very much, and I care about you already, even though we've only just met. Whatever happens, I would very much like to be your friend. Would that be acceptable?" Charlotte considered this for a long moment. Then, with the decisive nature of a child who knows her own mind, she nodded. "That would be acceptable," she agreed. "For now." "Charlotte, apologize to Miss Hartwood for putting her in an awkward position," Sebastian said. But his voice was gentler than his words. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwood." Charlotte did not sound particularly sorry. "But I meant what I said." "I know you did, sweetheart, and that's what makes it forgivable." They walked back through the park in a comfortable silence, Charlotte once again between them, her hands in theirs. Penelope was aware of Sebastian watching her, his grey eyes thoughtful, and she wondered what he was thinking. Was he imagining the same things she was imagining? A future where walks like this were everyday occurrences rather than stolen moments. A life where she might truly become part of this small, broken, hopeful family. It was too much to hope for. It was far, far too much. and yet she hoped anyway. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Penelope's life. Sebastian, she could not think of him as the Duke any more, not after everything they had shared called on her nearly every day. Sometimes he came alone, and they walked in the park or sat in her mother's drawing room making conversation while Lady Hartwood hovered nearby with barely concealed delight. Sometimes he brought Charlotte, and the three of them explored London together, the Tower, the Menagerie, the shops on Bond Street, where Charlotte pressed her nose to the window displays with a longing that broke Penelope's heart. "You must buy her something," Penelope insisted one afternoon, when Charlotte had been gazing at a porcelain doll with particular intensity. "She wants it so badly." "I have bought her everything she has ever asked for," Sebastian said quietly. "It has never seemed to be enough. Because she doesn't want things. She wants you." Penelope touched his arm gently, ignoring the shocked glances of passing shoppers. "She wants to know that you see her, that you care about her, that she is not simply an obligation to be managed from afar. The doll would be a symbol of that. The doll itself is almost irrelevant." Sebastian stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked into the shop and bought the doll. Charlotte's face, when he presented it to her, was something Penelope would remember for the rest of her life. The child looked at the doll, and then at her uncle, and then burst into tears and threw her arms around his waist. "You do love me," she sobbed into his coat. "You do. I wasn't sure, but you do." Sebastian's expression, as he held his niece and met Penelope's eyes over her dark head, was one of dawning understanding. The realization that love was not merely something to be protected against, but something to be actively, deliberately, courageously given. "I do," he said softly, and Penelope knew he was speaking to both of them. "God help me, I do." But even as their connection deepened, obstacles gathered on the horizon. Lady Hartwood, initially thrilled by the Duke's attentions, had begun to grow anxious. "He has not declared himself," she fretted to Penelope one morning while Arabella was at her music lesson and they had a rare moment of privacy. "He calls, he walks with you, he brings his niece, but he has made no formal offer. What is he waiting for?" "Perhaps he wants to be certain," Penelope said, though she had wondered the same thing herself. "He has been hurt before. It makes sense that he would proceed cautiously." "Caution is all very well, but your position is precarious. You have other suitors' genuine offers, some of them from respectable men who would provide you security. Mr. Bartholomew Green has made his interest quite clear." Penelope grimaced. Mr. Green was a wealthy merchant's son, perfectly pleasant, perfectly acceptable, and perfectly devoid of any spark or connection. The thought of marrying him made her stomach turn, but she could not deny the logic of her mother's concern. "I don't want Mr. Green, Mamma." "What you want is a luxury we cannot afford." Lady Hartwood's voice was sharp with worry. "You know our situation. Your father's health is failing, the estate is entailed, and when he dies, which the doctors say may be sooner than we hoped, you and your sisters will be left with nothing. Nothing, Penelope. I will not be able to provide for any of you." The words landed like stones. Penelope had known, in an abstract way, that their family's finances were strained. But she had not known that her father's illness was so serious, or that the future was so uncertain. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because there was nothing you could do about it. Because I hoped—" Lady Hartwood's voice cracked. "I hoped the Duke would make a quick offer, and all our problems would be solved. But he dallies and delays, and meanwhile Mr. Green grows impatient, and I am running out of options. I cannot marry Mr. Green, Mamma, not while there is any hope. Hope will not feed your sisters." Lady Hartwood's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Hope will not keep a roof over our heads. I love you, Penelope, and I want you to be happy. But I cannot let you sacrifice the entire family for the sake of a man who may never commit to you." Penelope felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders, a weight she had always known was there, but which had never seemed quite so heavy before. She was the eldest. She was supposed to lead the way, to make the brilliant match that would save them all, to do her duty regardless of her own desires. And her duty, it seemed, might not include Sebastian Ashworth. She did not tell him about the conversation. She did not tell him about Mr. Green's increasingly persistent courtship, or her mother's increasingly urgent pressure, or the growing certainty that she could not wait forever for a declaration that might never come. But Sebastian was not a fool. He saw the shadows in her eyes, the distraction in her manner, the way she sometimes looked at him as though trying to memorize his face. "Something is wrong," he said one afternoon, as they walked in the park while Charlotte fed the ducks. "You have not been yourself for days. Will you not tell me what troubles you?" "It's nothing." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "Family matters. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." "Penelope." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to weep. "We have been honest with each other from the beginning. Please do not start concealing things now." She looked at him, at his severe, handsome face, at the lines of concern around his eyes, at the man who had emerged from 3 years of grief to find connection with her, and felt her heart break a little. "My father is dying," she said quietly. "And when he dies, my mother and sisters will be left destitute. I need to make a match that will provide for them. You need to marry someone wealthy." "Yes." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "And you are uncertain whether I intend to make an offer? I know you care for me. I know that what we have is real." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "But you have not spoken of the future. You have not indicated any intention of formalizing what is between us. And I cannot wait indefinitely, Sebastian. Not when my family's survival is at stake." She saw something flash across his face. Pain, or guilt, or perhaps fear. "Penelope, Please don't make promises you cannot keep." Her voice cracked. "I would rather have honesty than false hope." "You think my hesitation means I do not intend to marry you? I think your hesitation means you are still afraid, and I understand that truly I do. But I cannot put my family's future at risk while you decide whether you are capable of loving again." Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him. "That is unfair." "Perhaps, but it is also true." They stood facing each other, the distance between them feeling much greater than the few feet that actually separated them. Charlotte's laughter floated up from the pond's edge, bright and oblivious, and somewhere in the trees a bird was singing. "I need time," Sebastian said finally, "to think, to sort out what I feel and what I am capable of offering you. I understand. Do you? Because I am not saying no, Penelope. I am saying—" He stopped, frustrated, his hands clenching at his sides. "I am saying that I have spent 3 years building walls, and you have dismantled them in a matter of weeks, and I do not know yet what is on the other side. I do not know if I am capable of being the man you deserve. I have never asked you to be anything other than what you are. No, you haven't." He reached out and took her hand, his grip tight, almost desperate. "Give me time. Please. I will not ask you to wait forever, but give me enough time to find my way forward." Penelope looked at their joined hands, his fingers wrapped around hers, and felt the impossible weight of a choice she did not want to make. "I will wait as long as I can," she said. "But Sebastian, I cannot sacrifice my family, not even for you." He nodded, his jaw tight, and released her hand. "I understand. I will consider what you have told me." They walked back through the park in silence, Charlotte skipping between them, unaware that anything had changed. But everything had changed, Penelope knew. The bright bubble of happiness they had been living in had developed a crack, and it was only a matter of time before it shattered entirely. That evening, her mother informed her that Mr. Green had made a formal offer. "He will settle £20,000 on you immediately, and an additional 10,000 on each of your sisters upon his death. He has also offered to provide for me in my widowhood." Lady Hartwood's voice was steady, but her eyes were pleading. "It is a generous offer, Penelope. More than generous. We would never have to worry about money again." "I don't love him, Mama. Love is a luxury for those who can afford it. We cannot." Penelope stared at the calling card in her mother's hand. Mr. Bartholomew Green, printed in elegant script, and felt the walls closing in around her. "I told you I would wait as long as I can," she said. "Please, give me a little more time." "How much more?" "The Harrington ball is in a fortnight. Let me see if anything changes between now and then." Lady Hartwood was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded, her expression grim. "A fortnight. But if the Duke has not declared himself by then, you will accept Mr. Green's offer. Do I have your word?" Penelope closed her eyes, feeling the weight of duty pressing down upon her. "You have my word." The fortnight that followed was an exquisite torture. Sebastian continued to call, but there was a tension between them now that had not been there before. He was solicitous, attentive, obviously struggling with something internal, but he did not speak of the future, did not make any declarations, did not give her the certainty she so desperately needed. Charlotte, sensing that something was wrong, became clingy and anxious. "You won't stop being our friend, will you?" she asked Penelope one afternoon, her small face creased with worry. "Even if you don't marry Uncle Sebastian?" "I will always be your friend, sweetheart, no matter what happens." But even as she said the words, Penelope knew they were a lie. If she married Mr. Green, she would have no reason to remain in the Duke of Thornfield's orbit. She would have no excuse to visit Charlotte, no opportunity to continue the connection they had built. Whatever happened, something precious would be lost. The night of the Harrington ball arrived like an executioner's dawn. Penelope, dressed in her finest gown, a cream silk with gold embroidery that had been her grandmother's, and tried not to think about the fact that this might be her last night of freedom. If Sebastian did not declare himself tonight, if he did not give her some sign that he intended to offer for her, she would accept Mr. Green's proposal tomorrow. She had given her word. The ballroom was glittering with candles and crystal, filled with the cream of London society in their most elaborate attire. Penelope moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting compliments and dance invitations with automatic grace, her eyes constantly searching for a dark head touched with silver, for grey eyes that had come to mean everything to her. She found him standing at the edge of the room, in his customary position, watching the dancers with his customary reserve. But when their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, something flared in his expression, something that looked almost like resolution. He began to move toward her, and then Edmund Ashworth stepped into her path. Sebastian's younger brother was everything Sebastian was not: charming, gregarious, always ready with a smile and a witty comment. But there was something cold beneath the surface, something calculating in his blue eyes that made Penelope immediately wary. "Miss Hartwood," he said, his voice carrying just loudly enough to be overheard, "I must say, you've been quite the talk of the town these past weeks. My brother is positively besotted with you." "Mr. Ashworth." Penelope tried to step around him, but he blocked her path with practiced ease. "Though I wonder if you're aware of exactly what you're getting into. Sebastian is damaged goods, shall we say. 3 years of mourning have taken their toll, and then there's the guilt, of course." I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? The accident that killed Helena and Charlotte's parents, Sebastian, blames himself for it, you know. He was supposed to accompany Helena to the modiste that day, but he chose to stay home and deal with estate business instead. If he had been there, perhaps he could have prevented it. Perhaps Helena would still be alive. Edmund's smile widened, sharp as a blade. That's why he can't bring himself to commit to anyone. He's terrified that if he loves again, he'll fail again. That he'll be responsible for another death. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. She had known about Sebastian's grief, about his guilt, but she had not known the specifics, had not known that he blamed himself for the accident that had taken his betrothed. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you deserve to know what you're dealing with. Edmund's voice was smooth as silk. My brother may call on you, may walk with you, may even believe he cares for you, but he will never marry you, Miss Hartwood. He is too broken to risk that kind of commitment. You're wasting your time. Before Penelope could respond, a new voice cut through the conversation. That's quite enough, Edmund. Sebastian had reached them, his expression cold as granite, his grey eyes blazing with barely suppressed fury. He stepped between his brother and Penelope, his body a shield, his presence a declaration. Brother. Edmund's smile didn't waver. I was simply having a friendly conversation with Miss Hartwood. You were poisoning her mind with half-truths and malicious speculation. Leave. Now. Or what? Edmund's voice dropped to a murmur. You'll make a scene? That's not like you, Sebastian. The Stone Duke doesn't make scenes. The Stone Duke is dead. Sebastian's voice was low, dangerous. And if you don't remove yourself from this ballroom in the next 30 seconds, you will discover exactly how much has changed. Something flickered in Edmund's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. He looked at Sebastian as though seeing him for the first time, and whatever he saw made him take a step back. Very well, he said smoothly. I can see I've overstayed my welcome. Miss Hartwood, it was a pleasure. He bowed and disappeared into the crowd, leaving silence in his wake. Sebastian turned to Penelope, and she saw that his hands were trembling. I apologize for my brother. What he said, was it true? The question emerged before she could stop it. Were you supposed to be in the carriage with Helena? Do you blame yourself for her death? The colour drained from Sebastian's face. Penelope, answer me, please. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes, I was supposed to go with her. I chose not to. And she died. And I have spent 3 years believing that if I had made a different choice, she would still be alive. Penelope felt tears prickling at her eyes. Oh, Sebastian, I couldn't save her. I couldn't protect her. And I have been terrified. His voice cracked. I have been terrified that if I let myself love again, I will fail again. That whoever I love will be taken from me, and it will be my fault, and I will not survive it a second time. Around them, the ballroom continued its glittering dance, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their corner. But Penelope saw none of it. She saw only Sebastian, his pain, his fear, his desperate struggle to emerge from 3 years of isolation and grief. You're afraid to love me, she said softly, because you're afraid of losing me. Yes. And that fear has kept you from making any commitment, any declaration, anything that would bind us together. Yes. Penelope felt something crack inside her. She had hoped, oh, how she had hoped that this ball would bring a resolution, a declaration, the happy ending she had dreamed of. But instead, she had confirmation of what she had feared. Sebastian cared for her, perhaps even loved her, but he was too broken to act on those feelings. I cannot wait any longer, she heard herself say. I told you my family's situation. I told you I needed certainty, and you have given me none. Penelope, please. Mr. Green has made me an offer, a generous one, enough to secure my mother and sisters for life. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. I promised my mother I would accept it if you did not declare yourself tonight. Sebastian's face went white. You cannot marry Green. You don't love him. Love is a luxury I cannot afford. You taught me that yourself by showing me exactly how dangerous it is to give your heart to someone who cannot accept it. That is not fair. Perhaps not. But it is true. She felt a tear slide down her cheek and brushed it away impatiently. Goodbye, Sebastian. I hope you find peace someday. I hope you learn to forgive yourself for Helena. I hope... Her voice broke. She could not continue. She turned and fled the ballroom, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the startled looks and whispered comments. She found her mother, made some excuse about a headache, and escaped to the carriage that would take her home. Behind her, Sebastian stood frozen, watching her go, and made no move to follow. The note arrived at Sebastian's townhouse the next morning. Your Grace, I wanted to thank you for your kindness to me over these past weeks. Our acquaintance has been a gift I will treasure always. I am writing to inform you that I have accepted an offer of marriage from Mr. Bartholomew Green. The betrothal dinner is tomorrow evening. I wish you every happiness. Yours sincerely, Miss Penelopey Hartwood. Sebastian stared at the words until they blurred before his eyes. Then he crumpled the note in his fist and sat in absolute stillness, feeling the walls he had thought demolished rebuilding themselves around his heart. She was going to marry Green. She was going to marry a man she did not love, because Sebastian had been too afraid to give her what she needed, because he had been too consumed by fear and guilt to see that the greatest failure of all was not risking love. It was letting love slip away. A knock at the study door interrupted his dark thoughts. Uncle Sebastian? Charlotte's small voice was hesitant. May I come in? He cleared his throat, tried to compose his features. Yes, sweetheart. Come in. Charlotte entered with her new doll clutched in her arms. She looked at his face, at the crumpled note in his hand, and her expression shifted into something that looked remarkably like adult determination. You're going to let her go, aren't you? She said. You're going to let Miss Hartwood marry that other man. It's not that simple, Charlotte. Yes, it is. The child marched up to him and fixed him with her grey stare, his stare, Helena's stare, the stare of everyone he had loved and lost. You love her. She loves you. You should marry her, and we should all be a family. That's simple. Charlotte, I know you're scared, Uncle Sebastian. I know you think that if you love someone, they'll go away, like Mama and Papa and Aunt Helena. I know because I think the same thing. Her voice wobbled, but she pressed on. But Miss Hartwood won't go away. She's brave and kind, and she makes you laugh. She makes me laugh too. And I don't want to lose her because you're too scared to fight for her. Sebastian stared at his niece, this small, fierce, grieving girl who had somehow found the courage to speak the truth he had been avoiding. When did you become so wise? He asked softly. I listened at doors a lot, and I thought about things. Charlotte's chin jutted out stubbornly. Are you going to let her go? Sebastian looked at the crumpled note in his hand. He thought about Penelope, her warmth, her honesty, her inability to stop talking when she was nervous. He thought about the way she had made him feel, for the first time in 3 years, like a person rather than a monument to tragedy. He thought about Helena, who had loved him, who had died, who would not have wanted him to spend the rest of his life alone and afraid. No, he said slowly, feeling something unlock inside him. I am not going to let her go. Charlotte's face broke into a grin. Then what are we going to do? Sebastian rose from his chair, his mind racing, plans forming faster than he could articulate them. "First," he said, "I need to visit my man of business, then my solicitor, then my banker." He looked down at his niece, at her hopeful face, at the trust in her eyes. "And then, Charlotte, we are going to crash a betrothal dinner." The morning of the betrothal dinner dawned grey and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Penelope stood at her bedroom window and watched the streets below slowly come to life, servants hurrying about their errands, carriages rattling past. The ordinary business of London continuing as though nothing of significance were happening at all. Perhaps nothing of significance was happening. Perhaps this was simply life, the ordinary, practical, sensible business of making the best of one's circumstances. People married for practical reasons every day. People set aside their feelings for the sake of duty every day. She was not special. Her situation was not unique. She was simply doing what countless women before her had done, choosing security over sentiment. The thought should have been comforting. It was not. She had not slept. She had lain awake through the long hours of the night, staring at the canopy above her bed, replaying every moment of the past weeks in her mind. Sebastian's face when he first asked her to dance, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. Charlotte's small hand in hers as they walked through the park. The sound of his voice saying her name, her Christian name, as though it were something precious. All of it was gone now. All of it had been a beautiful dream from which she had finally awakened, and the waking world was cold and colourless and filled with practicalities she could not escape. A knock at her door made her turn. "Come in." Arabella entered, still in her nightdress, her dark curls tumbled around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and when she saw Penelope standing at the window, she burst into tears. "Oh, Penny," she sobbed, rushing across the room to embrace her sister. "I can't bear it. I can't bear watching you do this." Penelope held her sister tight, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender from her hair. "Shh, dearest. It's going to be all right." "It's not. It's not going to be all right." Arabella pulled back, her face fierce despite the tears. "You love the Duke. Anyone can see it. And he loves you, I know he does. Why are you marrying Mr. Green when—" "Because love is not enough." The words came out steady, calm, as though Penelope were reading from a script she had rehearsed 1,000 times. "Because our family needs security, and Mr. Green can provide that. Because the Duke—" Her voice caught. "Because he is not able to offer me what I need. But if you just waited—" "I have waited. I have given him every opportunity." Penelope turned back to the window, unable to face her sister's distress. "He made his choice, Bella. He chose fear over love. I cannot change that. I can only accept it and move forward." "But you're so unhappy." "I will learn to be content. Many women do." Arabella was silent for a long moment. Then, in a small voice, she said, "I don't want to make a practical match when my time comes. I want to marry for love, like in the novels." Penelope closed her eyes against the pain those words caused. "I hope you can, dearest. I hope the world is kinder to you than it has been to me." The morning passed in a blur of preparations. Lady Hartwood was in her element, directing servants, arranging flowers, consulting with cook about the menu for the dinner. She was so clearly relieved, so obviously delighted that the family's future was finally secure, that Penelope found it impossible to share the full extent of her despair. What good would it do? The decision was made. The invitations had been sent. Mr. Green would arrive at 7 o'clock, and by the end of the evening, Penelope's fate would be sealed. She spent an hour with her father, sitting beside his bed in the darkened room where he spent most of his days now. Baron Hartwood had been a robust man once, full of life and laughter, but the illness had reduced him to a shadow of his former self. His skin was pale as parchment, his breathing laboured, his grip weak when he took her hand. "My dear girl," he whispered, I'm sorry I couldn't provide better for you. Sorry I couldn't." "Papa, don't." Penelope squeezed his hand gently. "You have given me everything I need. You have loved me, and believed in me, and taught me to be strong. That is more than enough. Green is a good man. He'll treat you well." "I know, Papa. But he's not—" Baron Hartwood's voice faltered. "I heard things, my dear. About a duke. About someone who made you smile." Penelope felt tears threatening and forced them back. "That is over now, Papa. It was a lovely dream, but it's over." Her father studied her face with eyes that, though dimmed by illness, still saw clearly. "Some dreams are worth fighting for, Penny. Some dreams are worth sacrifice. Not when the cost is too high. Not when my family's future hangs in the balance. Your family wants you to be happy. And I will be. In time." But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. She would never be happy with Mr. Green. She would be comfortable, perhaps. Content, eventually. But happy? The kind of happiness she had glimpsed during those brief weeks with Sebastian that was gone forever now. She kissed her father's forehead and left the room before her composure could crack. The afternoon brought a steady stream of well-wishers, friends and acquaintances, calling to congratulate the Hartwood family on the match. Penelope smiled and thanked them, and accepted their good wishes with the graceful manners her mother had drilled into her from childhood. If anyone noticed that her smile did not reach her eyes, they were too polite to mention it. At 6 o'clock, she began to dress for the dinner. Her mother had ordered a new gown for the occasion, pale blue silk with silver embroidery, elegant and expensive, and utterly unlike anything Penelope would have chosen for herself. As Arabella helped her into it, fastening the countless tiny buttons up the back, Penelope felt as though she were donning a costume for a role she had never wanted to play. "You look beautiful," Arabella said quietly. "I look like a sacrifice." "Penny, forgive me. That was unfair." Penelope studied her reflection in the mirror, seeing a stranger looking back at her. "I'm just tired. It's been a long few days." Arabella said nothing, but her expression spoke volumes. At 6:30, Lady Hartwood summoned Penelope to the drawing-room. The flowers had been arranged, the candles lit, the table in the dining room set with their best china and crystal. Everything was perfect, polished, exactly as it should be. Everything except Penelope's heart. "You will be charming," Lady Hartwood instructed. "You will be gracious. You will give Mr. Green no reason to regret his choice." "Yes, Mamma. And for heaven's sake, try to look happy. This is supposed to be a celebration." Penelope fixed a smile on her face and hoped it would be enough. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Penelope heard voices in the entryway, Mr. Green's pleasant tenor, the butler's measured tones. In a moment he would enter the drawing-room, and she would rise to greet him, and the evening would begin, and by the time it ended, she would be formally betrothed to a man she did not love. The drawing-room door opened, but it was not Mr. Green who entered. It was the Duke of Thornfield. He stood in the doorway, immaculately dressed in evening clothes of dark charcoal, his silver-touched hair gleaming in the candlelight. His grey eyes found hers immediately, and in them she saw something she had never seen before. Not hesitation, not fear, but absolute determination. Charlotte stood beside him, clutching her porcelain doll, her small face bright with anticipation. "What is the meaning of this?" Lady Hartwood's voice was sharp with outrage. "Your Grace, this is a private dinner. You have not been invited." "I am aware." Sebastian's voice was calm, steady. "I apologize for the intrusion, Lady Hartwood, but I have something I must say to your daughter, something that cannot wait. This is highly improper. Mamma." Penelope's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Please, give us a moment." Lady Hartwood looked from Penelope to the Duke and back again. Whatever she saw in their faces made her hesitate, and then, with visible reluctance, she nodded. 5 minutes. I will be in the hall with Mr. Green." She swept out of the room, leaving the door pointedly open behind her. Sebastian crossed the room in 3 swift strides and stopped before Penelope. He was close enough to touch, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "I know I have no right to be here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know I have given you no reason to listen to anything I have to say, but I am asking you, begging you to hear me out before you commit yourself to Green." Penelope's heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. "Sebastian, I was a coward." The words came out raw, unpolished. "For 3 years, I hid behind walls of grief and guilt, telling myself I was honoring Helena's memory when really I was just afraid. Afraid to feel again, afraid to risk again, afraid that if I let myself love someone, I would lose them too, and it would destroy me completely. I know. You told me I wasn't finished." He reached out and took her hands, his grip warm and firm around her fingers. "I was afraid, yes, but I was also wrong. Wrong to think that the answer to grief was isolation. Wrong to think that protecting my heart meant closing it off entirely. Wrong to let you walk away without fighting for you." Penelope felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you." His voice cracked on the words, raw with emotion. "I love you, Penelope Hartwood. I love your honesty and your warmth and the way you can't stop talking when you're nervous. I love that you stepped on my foot and apologized as though you'd committed a mortal sin. I love that you saw me, the real me. Not the title or the tragedy from the very first moment. Sebastian, I'm not finished." He released one of her hands and reached into his coat, drawing out a folded document. "I have spent the past 24 hours with my solicitors and my banker. This is a deed of settlement, Penelope. It transfers £50,000 into a trust for your mother and sisters, regardless of whether you marry me or not. Your family's debts have been paid. A small estate has been purchased in their names. They will never want for anything again." Penelope stared at the document, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. You did this for them?" "I did this for you, because I could not bear the thought of you sacrificing yourself for your family's security, because you deserve to make your choice freely, without the weight of duty crushing you." He pressed the document into her hands. "This is not a condition or a bargain. This is a gift, freely given. Your family is provided for. You owe me nothing. You owe Green nothing. For the first time in your life, you are free to choose what you actually want." Penelope looked down at the deed, at the numbers and signatures that represented her family's salvation. Then she looked up at Sebastian's face, at the hope and fear warring in his grey eyes. "And what do you want?" she whispered. "I want you." His voice was steady now, the trembling gone. "I want to spend the rest of my life making you laugh, and listening to you talk and dancing with you at every ball, until neither of us can stand. I want to give Charlotte the family she deserves, a proper family, with a mother who loves her and siblings to play with, and a home full of warmth instead of grief." He released her other hand and dropped to one knee before her. "I want to marry you, Penelope Hartwood. Not because I'm afraid of losing you, but because I'm finally brave enough to believe that I deserve to keep you." Behind them, Penelope heard a small sound. Charlotte, unable to contain her excitement, bouncing on her toes with her doll clutched to her chest. "Say yes," Charlotte whispered urgently. "Please say yes, Miss Hartwood." Penelope looked at the child, at her hopeful face, at the longing in her grey eyes. Then she looked at Sebastian, still kneeling before her, waiting for her answer. For 3 seasons, she had felt like she was assembled from the wrong pieces, like there was something fundamentally wrong with her, something that made her unable to be what she was supposed to be. But Sebastian didn't want what she was supposed to be. He wanted her, exactly as she was, awkward and honest and utterly herself. "Yes," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "Yes, Sebastian. Yes to everything. Yes to you." He rose in one fluid motion and pulled her into his arms, and when his lips met hers, Penelope felt the last of her fears dissolve like morning mist. This was right. This was real. This was the happy ending she had never dared to hope for. Behind them, Charlotte cheered loud enough to bring Lady Hartwood rushing back into the room, with Mr. Green trailing uncertainly behind her. The scene that followed was chaotic. Lady Hartwood, confronted with the sight of her eldest daughter in the arms of a duke, had to be revived with smelling salts. Mr. Green, displaying the good sense that had made him successful in business, assessed the situation quickly and withdrew his suit with gracious dignity, remarking only that he was happy to see Miss Hartwood so well settled and that he wished her every joy. "I never stood a chance, did I?" he asked Penelope quietly, as he prepared to take his leave. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "You deserved better than a woman whose heart belonged to someone else." "I'll recover." He smiled, and there was no bitterness in it. "And perhaps someday I'll find a woman who looks at me the way you look at him." "I hope you do, Mr. Green. I truly do." He bowed and departed, and Penelope felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the weight of guilt, of obligation, of the choice she had almost made. The evening transformed from a betrothal dinner into a celebration of an entirely different kind. Lady Hartwood, once she had recovered from her shock and been shown the deed of settlement, embraced Sebastian with more enthusiasm than propriety strictly allowed. Arabella wept with joy and declared that she had known all along it would work out. Even the servants seemed to catch the spirit of the moment, smiling as they cleared away the untouched first course and brought out champagne instead. Charlotte sat beside Penelope at the table, refusing to let go of her hand, chattering excitedly about all the things they would do once they were a proper family. "We can have picnics," she said, "and go to the menagerie, and you can teach me to make daisy chains like you showed me in the park, and when you have babies, I can help take care of them, because I'm very responsible." "That's getting rather ahead of things, sweetheart," Sebastian said dryly. "Perhaps we should manage the wedding first." "When will the wedding be?" "As soon as possible," Penelope said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I've waited long enough. I don't want to wait any longer." Sebastian's eyes met hers across the table, and the look in them made her heart race. "Neither do I." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the small chapel at Thornfield Manor. It was not the grand society event that Lady Hartwood had initially envisioned. There were no hundreds of guests, no elaborate decorations, no ostentatious display of wealth and consequence. There was only family the Hartwoods, the few Ashworth relatives who had accepted Sebastian's change of heart, and a handful of close friends who had been invited to witness the union. Charlotte served as flower girl, scattering rose petals down the aisle with solemn concentration. Arabella stood as Penelope's attendant, her dark eyes shining with happy tears. And at the altar, Sebastian waited with an expression of such profound joy that several of the guests remarked afterward that they would not have recognized the Stone Duke if they hadn't seen the transformation with their own eyes. Penelope walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Baron Hartwood was weak, too weak, really, for the journey to Thornfield, But he had insisted on being present for his daughter's wedding, and no one had had the heart to refuse him. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on Penelope's support, but his face was radiant with happiness. "I told you some dreams were worth fighting for," he whispered as they reached the altar. "You were right, Papa, as always." He kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Sebastian's, and then stepped back to take his seat beside Lady Hartwood, who was already dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor and cherish until death should part them. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian kissed her with such tenderness that Penelope felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "My wife," he murmured against her lips. "My Duchess. My love." "My husband," she replied. "My Duke. My home." Charlotte, unable to contain herself any longer, launched herself at both of them, wrapping her small arms around their waists and squeezing tight. "We're a family now," she declared. "A real, proper family." Sebastian lifted her into his arms and held her close, meeting Penelope's eyes over the child's dark head. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly. "We are." The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of Thornfield Manor, which had been transformed from a cold, austere space into something warm and welcoming. Flowers filled every corner, roses and lilies, and the humble daisies that Penelope had taught Charlotte to weave into crowns. Candles blazed in the chandeliers, casting golden light across the faces of the assembled guests. And at the center of it all, at the head table, Sebastian and Penelope sat hand in hand, unable to stop smiling at each other. "I have a gift for you," Sebastian said quietly, as the last course was cleared away. "Something I've been waiting for the right moment to present. You've given me quite enough gifts already." Penelope gestured at the ring on her finger, the beautiful sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to Sebastian's grandmother. "This alone is more than I ever expected. This is different." He reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box, which he placed in her hands. "Open it." Penelope lifted the lid and gasped. Inside, nestled on a bed of white silk, was a brooch, a delicate golden flower set with tiny pearls and a single diamond at its center. "It was Helena's," Sebastian said quietly. "Her mother gave it to her on her 16th birthday. After she died, I couldn't look at it. I put it away and tried to forget it existed." Penelope looked up at him, uncertain. "Sebastian, I can't accept this. It was hers. And now I want it to be yours." His voice was gentle but firm. "Not because I want to replace her, or forget her, or pretend that part of my life never happened, but because she would have wanted me to be happy. She would have wanted someone to wear this, and treasure it, and carry a piece of her forward into the future." He lifted the brooch from the box and pinned it carefully to her dress, just above her heart. "I spent 3 years running from my grief, Penelope. I don't want to run anymore. I want to remember Helena with love and gratitude, not with guilt and pain. And I want you, my wife, my partner, my future, to help me do that." Penelope touched the brooch gently, feeling the cool smoothness of the pearls, the sharp brightness of the diamond. "I will treasure it always," she said. "And I will help you remember her not as a loss to be mourned, but as a love to be celebrated." Sebastian's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and sweet, and when he pulled back, his smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Dance with me?" he asked, rising and extending his hand. The musicians had begun to play a waltz, slow and romantic. The other guests had risen from their seats, couples drifting onto the floor, and there, in the center of it all, Sebastian and Penelope began to dance. She still wasn't very good. She still lost count of the steps, still moved left when she should have moved right, still had to concentrate hard just to avoid treading on his feet. But it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the warmth of his hand in hers, the solid strength of his arm around her waist, the way he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. "You're counting again," he murmured. "Old habits die hard. Stop counting. Just feel." She closed her eyes and let herself be guided, trusting him to lead her, trusting the music to carry them. And for the first time in her life, dancing felt not like a performance or a trial, but like a joy. Charlotte joined them eventually, inserting herself between them with all the confidence of a child who knows she is loved. They danced together, the three of them, laughing and stumbling and making a thorough mess of the waltz, and it was perfect, absolutely perfect. Later that night, after the guests had departed, and Charlotte had been tucked into bed with her porcelain doll, Sebastian led Penelope through the quiet halls of Thornfield Manor to the master suite. The room had been transformed in her absence. Fresh flowers stood on every surface, candles burned in silver holders, and the great four-poster bed was draped in silk and scattered with rose petals. But Penelope barely noticed the decorations. Her attention was fixed entirely on her husband, on the way he looked at her, on the tension in his body, on the love that blazed in his grey eyes. "Are you nervous?" he asked softly. "A little." She laughed, self-conscious. "I talk too much when I'm nervous. You know that." "I do know that. I find it charming. You're the only one who does." "Then I'm the luckiest man in the world." He crossed to her and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle, reverent. "I love you, Penelope. I love everything about you, your honesty, your warmth, your inability to censor yourself. I love that you stepped on my foot and changed my life. I love that you gave me back my heart when I thought it was lost forever." "I love you too," she whispered. "Even when you were cold and distant and hiding behind your walls. I saw you, Sebastian. I saw the man you really were, and I loved him." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and there was nothing gentle about it. This was hunger, passion, 3 years of frozen grief melting in the fire of their connection. Penelope kissed him back with equal fervour, her hands fisting in his coat, her body pressing close to his. "I don't want to hurt you," he murmured against her lips. "You won't. I've been alone so long. I've forgotten how to—" She silenced him with another kiss. "Then we'll learn together." And they did. Later, much later, they lay tangled together in the great bed, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The candles had burned low, casting soft shadows across the room, and somewhere in the distance an owl was calling. "I was so afraid," Sebastian said quietly. "For 3 years, I was afraid to feel anything, because feeling meant risking loss. But now—" He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Now I understand that the risk is worth it. That loving you, even with the possibility of losing you, is infinitely better than the emptiness of trying to protect myself. You're not going to lose me. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise to love you for whatever time we have. I can promise to fill every day with joy and laughter and, yes, probably some moments where I say exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time." She lifted her head to look at him, smiling. "I can promise to step on your foot at every ball for the rest of our lives." He laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind she had only heard from him a handful of times. "I would like that. Very much." "Then that's what I'll do." She settled back against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And when we're old and grey and can barely walk, I'll still step on your foot, just to remind you of how we began." "I don't need reminders," he said softly. "I will remember every moment of loving you until the day I die." They slept then, wrapped in each other's arms, and when morning came, they woke to a new life, a life built on love and trust and the courage to be vulnerable. It was, Penelope thought, the happiest awakening of her existence. The years that followed were full ones. Charlotte blossomed under their care, transforming from a grieving, anxious child into a confident young woman. She learned to laugh again, to play again, to trust that the people she loved would not disappear without warning. By the time she turned 14, she had become the big sister Penelope's children desperately needed, bossy, affectionate, and utterly devoted to the growing brood that filled Thornfield Manor with noise and chaos. James Sebastian Ashworth, Marquis of Thornhill, arrived exactly 11 months after the wedding, a robust, dark-haired boy with his father's grey eyes and his mother's tendency to babble when excited. Sebastian held him for the first time with an expression of such awed wonder that Penelope wept, and Charlotte declared herself his official protector before the midwife had even left the room. 2 years later came the twins, Rose Helena and Catherine Helena, named for both the love Sebastian had lost and the mother Penelope had come to adore. They were as different as two children could be, Rose bold and adventurous, Catherine quiet and thoughtful, but united in their absolute devotion to each other and their thorough domination of the household. The family grew and changed and flourished. There were challenges, of course, disagreements and difficulties, and moments when the weight of Sebastian's past threatened to drag him back into darkness. But Penelope was always there, with her warmth and her honesty and her absolute inability to let him retreat behind his walls. She pulled him back into the light, again and again, until the light became his natural home. Baron Hartwood lived to see his first grandchild born, passing peacefully in his sleep 6 months after James's arrival. Lady Hartwood mourned him deeply, but she did not lack for comfort. Her daughters surrounded her, her grandchildren adored her, and the security Sebastian had provided meant she would never want for anything. Arabella married for love, as she had always sworn she would, wedding a charming young vicar who worshipped the ground she walked on. The younger Hartwood sisters found their own paths, one marrying a naval officer, another a barrister, and the youngest shocking everyone by declaring she intended to remain unmarried and devote herself to charitable works. Lady Hartwood despaired, but Penelope only smiled and told her mother that happiness came in many forms. The Dowager Duchess of Thornfield, Sebastian's mother, proved more difficult to win over. She had never approved of her son's choice of bride, viewing Penelope as beneath the dignity of the Ashworth name. But even her stony heart melted eventually, worn down by Penelope's patient kindness and the obvious happiness of her grandchildren. By the time Rose and Catherine were old enough to walk, the Dowager had become their fiercest champion, showering them with gifts and attention, and declaring to anyone who would listen that her daughter-in-law had turned out to be a remarkable woman after all. Edmund Ashworth, banished to Scotland after his malicious behaviour at the Harrington ball, eventually reformed himself enough to be permitted back into the family's good graces. He never became close with Sebastian. Too much had passed between them for true reconciliation, but he carved out a respectable life for himself, married a Scottish heiress, and managed not to cause any further scandals. It was, Sebastian remarked dryly, the best they could have hoped for. But it was the ordinary moments that Penelope treasured most. Sunday mornings at Thornfield, when the children climbed into their bed and demanded stories. Long walks through the estate, Charlotte explaining various botanical facts to anyone who would listen, while James chased butterflies and the twins collected rocks for reasons no one quite understood. Dinner parties that dissolved into laughter when Penelope inevitably said something she shouldn't. Quiet evenings in the library. Sebastian reading aloud while Penelope stitched, and the fire crackled, and the children drowsed on cushions at their feet. These were the moments that made a life. These were the moments that mattered. 7 years after their wedding, on a warm summer evening, the family gathered in the gardens of Thornfield Manor for what Charlotte had grandly termed a celebration of nothing in particular. The children were scattered across the lawn, James attempting to teach the twins how to play cricket, while Charlotte supervised from a blanket with all the dignity of her 14 years. The setting sun cast long golden shadows across the grass, and somewhere in the trees, birds were singing their evening songs. Penelope sat on a stone bench, watching her family with a heart so full it ached. Sebastian dropped down beside her, his arm coming around her waist, his lips pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happy?" he asked. "Absurdly, ridiculously, almost obscenely happy." He laughed softly. "Good. I intend to keep you that way for the next 50 years. "Only 50? I'm trying to be realistic. We may not live much longer than that." "Speak for yourself. I intend to live forever, if only to continue stepping on your foot at balls." "Ah, yes. Speaking of which." He rose and extended his hand, his grey eyes twinkling with mischief. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" Penelope looked around at the garden, at the children, at the complete absence of music or any semblance of a dance floor. "Here? Now? Why not? We have the most beautiful ballroom in England." He gestured at the sunset-painted sky, the flower-filled gardens, the children who had stopped their game to watch with curious eyes. "And I believe I hear a waltz beginning. You're ridiculous. Probably. Dance with me anyway." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. He began to hum something vaguely waltz-like, though his sense of pitch was questionable at best, and they began to move, right there on the lawn, spinning slowly as the children giggled, and Charlotte rolled her eyes with adolescent dignity. "I was so lost before you found me," Sebastian said quietly, his lips close to her ear. "I was frozen, numb, convinced that I would never feel anything again. And then you stepped on my foot, and talked too much, and said inappropriate things, and generally made a spectacle of myself, and saved my life." His arms tightened around her. "You saved my life, Penelope. You gave me back my heart. You gave me this family, this joy, this everything." She looked up at him, at his beloved face, the grey eyes that had once been cold and were now warm with love, the smile that had taken 3 years to reclaim. "You gave me everything too," she said. "You saw me when no one else did. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. You showed me that being myself was not a flaw to be corrected, but a gift to be treasured." "It is. You are." He kissed her, soft and sweet, while their children made exaggerated sounds of disgust, and Charlotte threatened to cover the twins' eyes. "Uncle Sebastian and Aunt Penelope are being disgusting again," Rose announced to anyone who would listen. "They're always disgusting," Catherine agreed. "They're in love," Charlotte said, with the worldly wisdom of a girl who had seen more of heartache and healing than most adults. "That's what people in love do." "Then I'm never falling in love," James declared firmly. "It seems very unsanitary." Sebastian and Penelope broke apart, laughing, and gathered their children around them for what had become a family tradition, the evening daisy chain. They sat in a circle on the grass, the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, the Marquis of Thornhill, Lady Charlotte, Lady Rose, and Lady Catherine, and wove chains of flowers as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to appear. "Tell us the story again," Rose demanded, "about how you and Papa met." "You've heard it 100 times," Penelope protested. "We want to hear it 101 times," Catherine said. "Please, Mamma." Penelope looked at Sebastian, who nodded with a small smile. Then she turned back to her children, gathered them close, and began. Once upon a time, there was a duke who didn't dance. For 3 whole years, he stood at the edges of ballrooms and watched, but he never joined in because he was too sad and too scared. And then one night, at a very grand ball, a very clumsy young lady stepped on his foot. The children listened with rapt attention, even though they knew every word by heart. Charlotte smiled at the parts she had lived through. James made faces during the romantic bits. The twins held hands and sighed when their parents looked at each other with that particular expression that meant love. And when the story ended with a wedding and a family and a lifetime of dancing together, Sebastian pulled Penelope close and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for stepping on my foot, for changing my life, for giving me everything I never knew I needed." Penelope smiled, leaning into his warmth, surrounded by the children they had created together and the love they had built from the ashes of grief. "Thank you for asking me to dance," she whispered back, "and for not letting me go." Above them, the stars emerged in their ancient patterns, and the night wrapped around them like a blessing. The children's laughter rang out across the gardens, mingling with the song of night birds and the rustle of wind through the roses. And the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield sat in the midst of it all, their fingers intertwined, their hearts full, dancing together without music under the endless sky.